Oh, hey there! Did you know that in the last 3 years, there have been over 30,000 games released on Steam? Think about that number for a second. 30,000. That's basically 30 brand new games released on Steam every single day for 3 years. We are well beyond the point where it's even feasible to own, let alone play, every single one of these games. There just isn't enough time. If you ask any of your gamer friends what they're playing, they will inevitably tell you about their endless backlog of games. We've all got one. And if you play games across multiple platforms like I do, then I'm sure yours is just as ridiculous as mine is. Not only is the influx of new games enormous, but the size of the games themselves has also grown dramatically. Companies now are making games that can take hundreds of hours, if not more, to fully complete, and that's not even including things like the MMOs and live service games that everybody is also playing. Being a game dev, let alone an indie game dev in this day and age, is extremely challenging. The odds of your game being discovered by the general masses is unfortunately rather low. But every now and then, the stars align and a new indie bursts onto the scene, standing out above the endless ocean of all the other titles. You've seen the thumbnail, you've read the title, so you already know where this is going. That's right, this is just another video about Berserk Boy. Typically when I make these Java videos, they're just that. Just another video about a specific game. Typically one that's already been covered to hell and back, but now I want to give my own thoughts and feelings on it. And yet here I am talking about a game that releases tomorrow as of uploading this video anyway. So let's just refer to this as my first sip of Java because it's a brand new title. For clarity's sake, I was given this game early. In fact, I had already completed it a month before it released. But that being said, all of the opinions in this video are mine and mine alone. Also, with this being a brand new title, I won't be spoiling any of the story or the final boss or anything like that. But keep in mind, what you consider a spoiler versus what I consider a spoiler might be a bit different. So if you want to go in completely blind, I recommend just bookmarking this and coming back later.
Or hey, maybe just mute it and play it in the background so the view still counts.
Normally when I cover a game, I like to talk a bit about the development history and then my own personal history with it before I get into my thoughts and feelings about the game as a whole. This is going to be a little different though, because those first two topics are going to be much shorter and basically merged together now. You see, I've been following Berserk Boy off and on for quite a while on social media. Because of working in the industry, as well as my own personal interest, I like to keep an eye on various indie games, be that at conventions or on the internet.
A couple of years ago, I'd started seeing friends share and retweet some footage and pictures of Berserk Boy, and it immediately caught my eye with its visual aesthetic. Time would go by though, and for one reason or another, I stopped hearing about it, which I'm sure could easily be related to the dynamic change in social media in the last couple of years, and how hard it's been to keep up with even people that you're closest with. That is until January 30th, 2024, when I saw this tweet about requesting a key for the game.
I figured, why the hell not, and filled out the application. And a single day later, I received an email directly from the lead developer, Zu Edisham, personally gifting me a code, which not only blew me away, but also made my day. Now, for those of you unaware, early access to an unreleased video game is a pretty big deal. I'm not saying that to brag or anything, but to make the point that as a game developer, you are putting a lot of trust into complete strangers to not break the embargo with your game. The last thing any game developer wants is for their game to show up in the public eye before they are 100% ready to show it off. So to have a developer put that faith and put that trust in you is a pretty big deal to me. Since I received a key, I already knew I was going to be doing a video on the game, whether I enjoyed it or not. However, I wasn't prepared for how much I was going to enjoy it. The initial email I got from Zu was on February 1st, and by the next day, I had already completed the entire game. And that's not me saying the game is short, that's me saying that's how many hours I sunk into the game practically in one sitting.
Once I started up Berserk Boy, it completely took over my life. I shifted focus hard to this game. When a new game or series I love is announced or released, I often find myself excited, but also there's this weird sense of dread. Well, dread is probably too strong of a word, but it's an anxious feeling, not far off from the fear of missing out, that I need to get through when everybody else does, so I don't get spoiled, or I don't know, so I don't miss the social wave everybody else is riding. And yet, while everybody else is playing Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth, Prince of Persia, and Pal World, I was obsessing over Berserk Boy. Hell, my collector's edition of Persona 3 Reload, a game I've been very excited to play, showed up the same day, and I completely ignored it. When a game is so good that it erases the guilt of not playing other games, that's when I know I found a real gem.
So how did this game even come to be? Well, I kept up with Zoo over email, and he was kind enough to actually go over some of the details.
In fact, he was even kind enough to share some early sketches and drawings, which are on the screen now. And let me just say, this kind of stuff is like gold to me. I absolutely love learning about the development of games, but being able to see early art iterations is just amazing. So a huge thanks to Zoo for sharing this and allowing me to show all of you. Zoo let me know that he had made fan games for a pretty long time, but none of them had seen the light of day, such as attempting to make Sonic-inspired engines. His first serious project was a horror Metroidvania, which never saw completion, and trust me, with as big of a Castlevania fan as I am, reading those words hurt, and I would definitely love to see Zoo's take on a Metroidvania style game in the future. Over time, he started making some iterations on what would eventually become Berserk Boy. Initially, it was planned to be a lot slower, with more of a focus on hand-to-hand combat. Then, about a year into development, it transformed into the zippy platformer that it is today. Zoo's inspiration for Berserk Boy stemmed from Sonic and Mega Man, which I'd say are definitely the more obvious ones, but also Dragon Ball Z, Pulse Man, and Rocket Knight. Personally, I was able to pick up on the Pulse Man and Rocket Knight inspiration almost immediately, due in part to the size of the sprites. A lot of Genesis and Mega Drive platform action games tended to have bulkier character sprites compared to what was showing up on Nintendo at the time. This wasn't the case for all games, of course, but there was certainly a visual aesthetic to some of these Genesis games that I feel Berserk Boy emulates really well with its main characters. He also took inspiration from anything Inti creates, which, if you've played any Inti creates games, would make complete sense, because they really do have a very unique style to them. Zoo is the lead designer and artist for the game, with T-Lopes of Sonic Mania fame handling the music. There are also a handful of other musicians that remix songs for the third act of each stage. Normally, I'd list them, but as of writing and recording this, their involvement hasn't been made public yet, so to not step on any toes, I'll forego doing so here.
Prior to release, Berserk Boy took place in Steam's Next Fest, which highlights demos of upcoming indie games. From postings seen on social media, I'd say it was pretty well received overall, with its official release date being March 6th, 2024. So with all that out of the way, what exactly is Berserk Boy? But also, if you've been enjoying my dulcet tones as I cover a brand new game, and you want to see me cover more new games in the future, consider clicking that little subscribe and pressing the dumb little thumbs up, because I want the channel to grow and me saying these words apparently helps.
If we were to go off the Steam description, it's a high-speed action platformer with Metroidvania elements. But personally, I feel that's a bit off, but not necessarily in a bad way. Berserk Boy is definitely an action platformer, that much is certain, but the speed is dependent entirely on the player, which I think is actually a good thing. You certainly can zip through stages as quick as possible, similar to say Sonic performing multiple homing attacks on enemies, or you could play at a slower, more methodical pace, similar to its Mega Man inspirations. You can't really go wrong either way though, and that's a huge plus. As for the Metroidvania elements, they're definitely a lot lighter than what you might expect, and again, I think this is probably a good thing in the long term, but I'll explain that further in a bit. When you first start the game, you can choose to play in Modern or Retro mode. Modern gives you infinite lives, whereas Retro you'll have a limited amount of lives, meaning you'll need to play more carefully. You take the role of K, a member of the Resistance, a group fighting against Dr. Genos and his band of dark energy minions. Early on, Kay's friend Dizzy detects readings of what she believes to be a Berserk Orb, items that beings can merge with to gain various powers. Upon investigating, Kay and Dizzy are separated. Kay meets up with a talking bird, Fiore, eventually finding the Berserk Orb, merging with it, and gaining his first Berserk form. This places you on the road of tracking down and eventually confronting Dr. Genos. Movement-wise, you can run left or right and jump. Kay can perform a dash with the left trigger, as well as the leftmost button on your controller. The rightmost button is your heavy attack, which for all intents and purposes feels like your normal attack. Personally, I immediately went into the controller settings and swapped the left and right buttons. Having played Mega Man X and Zero for decades with this layout, I'm just way too accustomed to doing a claw grip on the controller, so I typically dash with the rightmost button, jump with the bottom button, and attack with the leftmost button. It's just what feels right for me. But conveniently, you can swap the controls to suit your exact playstyle, so finding what works for yourself is pretty easy. The rightmost trigger activates your Berserk move, which is unique for each form you get. This is a high-powered attack, usually encompassing a larger area than your standard attacks. It has an energy bar associated with it, so it's a move that should only be used when you deem it's necessary. As you gain more forms, you can either use the right analog stick to bring up a wheel for you to select each form, or you can use the right and left bumper shoulder buttons to quickly cycle through them. Again, akin to Mega Man X's various movesets. Lastly, K has access to a wall jump. By repeatedly jumping into a wall, K will ascend to the top, and if you hold the D-pad or analog stick up against the wall, K will slowly descend. Overall, the movement is incredibly tight. Depending on the form you take, there are some minor adjustments you'll need to make here and there, because a lot of the forms do have some of their own movement properties. But in no time at all, you'll quickly find yourself rotating through all of the forms as you zip through stages and bounce off of the enemies. An example of some of the form differences is the fact that for many of the forms, the dash and dash alt buttons do the exact same thing, but not for every form, and that actually kind of threw me off a bit. Once I cover each form in detail, I'll go into that a bit more though. My only real gripe here is the fact that right now, you can only rebind the controls from the main menu. This is kind of a bummer, because until you start the game, you're not going to know if you like the button layout or not. The forms themselves are a lot of fun, and one of the best parts of this game is how every form is utilized in one way or another. If you've ever played a Mega Man game, you'll be familiar with the system, but essentially, as you battle specific bosses, you'll come to collect their Berserk orbs, gaining their abilities. To start, there's the base form K. He can dash and attack using Fiore. Nothing too crazy, but you can dash in all 8 directions, which is nice. Next up is a standard Berserk form K obtains at the beginning of the game. His attack here causes him to generate an electric force field around himself. As for the dash, it's quite a bit faster than your base form and has a longer reach. If you dash into enemies, not only will you bounce off and gain the ability to dash again, but you'll also tag them for a while, shown with this band of electricity connecting you to the enemy. Once you've done this, you can press the heavy attack button again and unleash a projectile that tracks down the enemy to further damage them. It's a very unique way of attacking, but honestly it just feels really good to do. Jumping and pressing down and jump at the same time will cause K to do a ground pound of sorts, damaging enemies and some destructible blocks. With this form being based on electricity, you'll occasionally find doors that need to be opened using this power. The next form is the Flame Drill. This is the fire form, where the dash is replaced by a full-body spinning tornado attack. Think of the Tasmanian Devil from Looney Tunes. You lose the ability to dash in all directions, but you can still perform this mid-air. Your heavy attack changes into a more standard physical punch combo. This is purely speculation on my part, but going off of what Zeus said with Berserk Boy originally focusing more on hand-to-hand combat, I'd be curious if this was a leftover idea from that. Regardless though, it just feels powerful. You're definitely not nearly as zippy as the standard Berserk Boy form, but your attacks hit hard. Performing a ground pound will cause K to drill into the ground to avoid enemies or traps. You can even pop out below enemies to damage them. Sometimes you'll encounter specific walls that allow you to progress or hide secrets, accessible only in this form. Lastly are these special platforms that move only when using the spinning tornado attack on them. Ice Kune is up next, and this is of course the ice form. The dash returns, but is slightly different than the Berserk form. There are objects that, when dashed into with this form, will let the dash continue on. This can be changed somewhat infinitely as long as you react and point K in the correct direction fast enough. The heavy attack also has K throw a handful of kunai at the enemy. These can be tossed extremely fast and are excellent for breaking through the defenses of shielded enemies. When thrown in the air, they cover a 90-degree angle, ranging from directly in front of K to down below him. Lastly is the ability to hang from various ropes and moving objects. Soaring Wind is definitely more of a utility form than anything else. As you might have guessed, this is the wind or air-based form. It allows you to fly for a limited time. Now remember when I said I was thrown off with the dash and dash alt thing earlier? This is what I was talking about. For the entire game, I was using the rightmost button on my controller to dash, but that was actually set as the dash alt. Well, when using the dash alt in Soaring Wind form, instead of dashing, you just put out this little shield that reflects projectiles. This led me to believe that it didn't have a dash at all, because I never used the left trigger to perform the dash in any other form. But surprise, it actually does have a dash. You just have to do it using the actual dash button, which is default set as the left trigger. Pressing the heavy attack causes the energy shield to circle K counterclockwise. Depending on how hard you press the button, the radius of the attack is adjusted, from being really close to K to being quite far away from him when it circles. It's an okay attack, but it's a bit awkward to use. I typically avoided this form, except when necessary to traverse certain areas. A big part of that was the fact that I didn't even realize it had a dash until after I beat the game and was writing the script. That's when I discovered that dash and dash alt are different for this form. And you know what else? They're different for the Mindbuster form as well. The Mindbuster is the Earth form, and it's definitely the most Mega Man form, I'd say. You no longer have the ability to dash because both the dash alt and heavy attack buttons do the same thing. When pressed, K will shoot out a group of spinning lasers that can be used to tag enemies. This remains out for as long as you hold the button down. Releasing the button after tagging enemies will cause K to shoot them. This move can also make invisible enemies and platforms visible, as well as break specific walls. Lastly, if you use the dash, not the dash alt button, this will cause an explosion under K, launching him vertically upward, and can be used as a double jump if performed after a standard jump. If used on specific platforms, it will allow you to perform a second or even third one, depending on how many of those platforms you were able to ignite under you. This form is definitely the slowest and has the least amount of moves, but it can become extremely powerful later on. That being said, I do think that the double jump move could have been tied to the dash alt button. Soaring Wind is the only form in the entire game with an extra move that requires the designation of dash and dash alt to be different. Whereas Mindbuster only has 2 moves, but for some reason your heavy attack and dash alt buttons both do the standard attack. I'm just not sure why the double jump wasn't tied to the dash alt. It's a minor complaint, but I do feel it's necessary to bring up. Something to note is that all forms use energy. There are technically 3 types of energy in the game: your health, your standard energy, and the Berserk energy used for large-scale Berserk attacks. Your standard energy is used for a handful of techniques in various forms. For instance, dashing will use a bit of the energy, so you're limited to how many times you can do it. Energy restores on its own over time, and quite quickly, so it isn't really a detriment. Think of it like the Order of Ecclesia MP bar, or simply put, the Dark Souls stamina bar. They're only ever going to be empty for a few seconds at a time. On top of which, enemies can drop energy, and it can also be found scattered throughout all the stages. Because of this, there was never a point in the time where I was running out of energy and had to stop and wait for it to refill. After beating this tutorial area, K will be transported to the Resistance base. This location just screams Mega Man Zero or Mega Man ZX. It's a large hub comprised of numerous screens with various NPCs scattered about that you can talk to. There's also an NPC that will upgrade your abilities at a cost. When you're ready to progress in the game, you speak with the commander and select a mission. All stages are broken up into 3 missions. You unlock them in a linear order, but once you've unlocked them, you can return to them at any point in the game. As you play through the stages, you'll come across various collectibles in the form of Berserk coins, as well as trapped members of the Resistance. Scattered throughout each stage are also checkpoints that act as teleporters. This is where the Metroidvania aspect starts to appear, because occasionally you might find these doors that signify that you need to rescue a certain amount of Resistance members before they'll open up. So you can ignore them, continue on, rescuing more members, and then teleport back to an earlier part of the stage to access these new hidden areas. You'll also sometimes come across an area requiring the use of an ability you haven't unlocked yet, meaning you'll need to replay the stage to get to those areas as well. When you find a Resistance member, they'll instantly be teleported back to the base. So even if you leave the stage, that progress will be saved. Berserk emblems are not treated this way though. Instead, when you find a Berserk emblem, you'll need to reach a teleporter for that progress to count. I wasn't a big fan of this personally, only because for me anyway, I would simply forget I found the coin and then die later on before hitting a checkpoint. So I'd continue on, complete the stage, and realize I was missing that coin. When you gather them, K specifically says, I have to get this to a teleporter, but somehow it just didn't always register with me that I lost them after I died, so I'd have to hunt for them all over again. Some of these coins can be well off the beaten path too, so it just becomes a case of wasting a bit of your time if you do end up losing them. To fully complete a stage, you'll need to find all of the Resistance members, as well as all of the Berserk medals. This isn't mandatory to beat the game, mind you, but at the very least, finding all the Resistance members in a stage will unlock an EX stage. These are optional challenge stages, consisting of high-speed platforming using a variety of your forms, and they are a lot of fun to play through. After you complete a stage, you'll be graded on your performance, from C, B, A, and the best being S. The higher your score, the better your grade, with each death you take being deducted from your overall score at the end of the stage. Stages either end with a boss fight or simply a teleporter depending on the mission you're on. The third mission of each stage is typically where you fight the other Berserk Orb users. Once you defeat them, you'll gain their ability and teleport back to base. And each time this happens, the base gets invaded with various enemies that need to be destroyed. This basically acts as a combat tutorial to learn the new forms you just acquired, and I think it's a neat touch. But it does become a little repetitive after, say, the 3rd time. The layouts of these stages is a spot where Berserk Boy really shines. Mission 1 of each stage is designed to be a more advanced tutorial of the form you received at the end of the previous stage. For instance, you receive Ice Kune at the end of the Frozen Temple, with the next stage being the Abandoned Labyrinth. Mission 1 of this stage relies heavily on the use of the Ice Kunai form.
I think this is a great way to introduce the new forms, and it doesn't feel like a tutorial in the slightest. About 3/4 of the way through the first mission, you're back to swapping to your previous forms, and by mission 2, you're suddenly using all of your forms again in a way that just feels natural. This is done with each new form you obtain. Mission 1 introduces the form, with missions 2 and 3 incorporating that form into your general rotation. To put it simply, this is fantastic game design. When I earn something in a game, I want it to be used. I want it to have a purpose.
For as many Mega Man games as I've played, it feels like a majority of the time, a lot of the abilities you gain just aren't used except on the bosses, whereas in Berserk Boy, because the abilities have their own movement styles and techniques, you'll need to use all of them to fully progress through stages and to find all the secrets. You can still go back to the form you enjoy playing the most, but there will be sections requiring you to use the other forms that you come across. You've got 16 missions spread across 6 stages, as well as 15 EX missions, so there's quite a lot to do and see. As for the bosses, I think they're good overall. The fights are typically quick and bombastic, and because each of the bosses also have a Berserk Orb, that means they too can have access to the Giga Crush Berserk attack, which is typically used once you get them below a certain health threshold. Each fight is definitely unique from one another, but honestly, I don't want to go too deep into detail on these because I think they're best experienced firsthand. As I mentioned earlier, the music was done by T-Lopes, and if you've heard any of the other T-Lopes OSTs, you'd recognize it right away. The songs are incredibly catchy and pair so well with Zoo's artwork. If this ever gets released on vinyl, you can bet 100% I'll be purchasing it. When I sat down to play Berserk Boy, I had no idea it was going to grip me as hard as it did. The gameplay is downright addicting, and I think there's something to be said about the game making me want to improve to the point where I wanted to go back and get S ranks on all of the stages. If I achieved an A or a B rank on a stage, I often found myself diving right back into the stage saying I can do better and then zipping straight to the end. I love it when a game can make you feel cool while playing it, and that is exactly what Berserk Boy does. Depending on the games you grew up with, I think there's a part of us that's always trying to recapture the feeling of the games of our youth. And for me personally, Berserk Boy really nails that. It carefully walks that line between feeling like a retro classic, but also feeling fresh and modern. I know that at first glance, this game is often going to be compared to Mega Man and Sonic. The inspirations are clearly there, but trust me when I say that Berserk Boy 100% has its own identity. It's not Mega Man, it's not Sonic. It's Berserk Boy, and it's f***ing awesome. So how do you feel about Berserk Boy? Do you plan on getting it day one, or did you purchase it day one? Do you plan on getting it in the future? Let me know in the comments down below. I also want to give a huge thank you to Zoo for not only giving me the game, but opening up about the history of it and sharing those images with me. I'm not sure what I did to deserve any of that, but thank you so much. That being said, my name is AJ, and this was just another video about Berserk Boy. I just want to give a thank you to the patrons that support me that are currently on the screen, as well as a super thank you to Hope Chronicler and Kumiko. The fact that you guys support me on Patreon really does mean a lot. It kind of blows me away that people are supporting these dumb little videos that I make here on YouTube. So thank you all so much, and I promise that in the future I will try to make this Patreon screen look a little bit better. It's a work in progress, but again, thank you all so much for the support, and I will see you in the next video.